This is a video adaptation of a lecture I presented at the International Islamic University, Islamabad as part of a U.S. State Department grant called IUI and UNCW, a collaborative model for enhanced teaching, research, and community engagement. In order to better understand how writing is taught in U.S. contexts, both online and in the classroom, this lecture will introduce to you how the field of rhetoric and composition developed in America, specifically how this field, often housed in the English department, but not always, studies the relationship between rhetorical theory and writing. The history of rhetoric is quite vast, but plays an integral role in how U.S. universities approach writing in higher education contexts. My goal for this presentation is to give you a small idea of how and why rhetoric is important to writing instruction in the U.S., and how those influences have shaped our approaches to writing in particular ways. First, I'll briefly discuss the origins of rhetoric, with which I am sure many of you are already familiar, how rhetoric came to the U.S., and how that has shaped the field of rhetoric and composition, or the study of writing. Though the academic field of rhetoric and composition is relatively new, the origins of rhetoric, of course, go back many of thousands of years to ancient Greece. Though rhetoric has many definitions, one of the most common is the art of persuasion. Though rhetoric existed even before Plato, Aristotle was the first to systemize the study of rhetoric, calling it the faculty of observing in any given case the available means of persuasion. In ancient Greece, through Roman times, these available means were most often associated with oral speeches. In these societies, if you wanted to get something done, at least as a member of the elite, you had to make a speech. At this time, writing was a new technology. But one can say that the invention of writing changed the way Greeks thought in significant ways. For the first time, words would be available for study and reflection. Students began to write down their notes on the teachings of great thinkers like Plato and Aristotle. Scholars have argued that this ability to see language in writing, to think and meditate on language visually, helped rhetoric emerge as a form of analysis. Many of these thinkers developed what they called heuristics, or systematic tools and methods that aid in the analysis and deployment of rhetoric. Aristotle created several heuristics to aid his students to become better speakers. The most common is often called the rhetorical triangle, where Aristotle breaks up the communicative act into three appeals: ethos, pathos, and logos. Ethos makes an appeal with a speaker's character, reputation, or credibility. It is how we portray ourselves to our audience. Pathos appeals through emotion or relational bonds. It is how we build empathy with our audience or community. And logos appeals to reason, or how we get our audience to think in similar ways as us. Rhetoric continued to be a centerpiece to education in Europe, though often defined in many different ways. I'll return to this heuristic later, but it is often used in many U.S. writing courses today. Throughout Western history, rhetoric was central to the education of the elite and powerful. To become a leader or citizen, one had to study and understand rhetoric. Romans like Cicero and Quintilian systemized the study of rhetoric by categorizing different forms of persuasion. For example, deliberative rhetoric that helps leaders make decisions and create consensus, mostly associated with the government or politics. Forensic rhetoric that helps determine what has happened in the past, mostly associated with the legal world. And epidictic rhetoric that celebrates or shapes how an audience sees the present, for example, celebrating a famous individual or religious idea. Though still focused on the political arena and the art of speech, writing was an integral part of the creation process, though not always explicitly so. From the very beginning, rhetoric has had a central importance in America, perhaps partly because of its relation to the origins of democracy in ancient Greece. Speeches were crucial to persuading the colonies to revolt against England. This was no easy task and shows the power of rhetoric has to change realities. With the rise of the printing press, the written word became the primary means of persuasion. Most of our country's founders studied this kind of rhetoric, and the American Revolution was fueled by the written word. For example, the Declaration of Independence. After the Revolution, the study of rhetoric was mostly influenced by a British philosophy called belletristic rhetoric. Thinkers like David Hume, Adam Smith, and Hugh Blair began to apply rhetorical principles that developed through medieval and Renaissance times to the written text. It is important to note that nearly all these thinkers were Scots, or from Scotland, a country oppressed by England for many years. To put it another way, they did not speak standard English. Developing the rhetorical and writing skills became a way for them to gain power and influence in England despite their stigmatized accents. Most of you have probably heard of David Hume, a major influence in Western philosophy, and Adam Smith, who wrote Wealth of Nations, but each of these wrote extensively on rhetoric. Hugh Blair is not as well known, but has had the most influence on American education because he compiled many of these ideas into a book of lectures, or what later became a textbook. This textbook was called Lectures on Rhetoric and Bell's Letters, and it was very popular in the U.S. This book was often used on its own, but many other textbooks and handbooks borrowed material from this book. At this time, there were really no copyright rules. As a result, the ideas were even more widespread than the book itself. One major influence of this textbook was examining rhetoric through the idea of taste, or cultivating our powers of receiving pleasure from beauties of nature and art, often associated with literature and poetry and narrative and philosophy. In belletristic rhetoric, style became one of the main focuses of rhetorical theory and studies, and also in writing instruction. And this style was most associated with simple, clear, and precise English, which was seen as the epitome of English discourse. And here's a quote that demonstrates that. Style became more precise and, of course, more simple as English progressed. Imagination, too, in proportion as society advanced, had less influence over mankind. In place of poets, philosophers became the instructors of men, and in the reasonings on all different subjects introduced that plainer, simpler style of composition, which we now call prose. And Hugh Blair claimed that English was actually more suited for developing philosophical ideas and scientific work due to its level of precision and simplicity. And this is when we really begin to develop the notion of plain English that is so powerful in academic discourse today. It is also important to note that these changes were happening during colonialism, shaping many of the language and educational policies of both England and the U.S. throughout the 18th, 19th, and 20th century. During this time in U.S. universities, there is a shift from classical education to English studies. The humanities began to centralize around English literature instead of texts from the Greeks and Romans. Most texts, then, were studied in English, whereas previously students also had to learn Greek and Latin. So the humanities became much more monolingual in the U.S. There was also more of a focus on consumption, or reading, or literature, instead of production, or writing or making speeches. And finally, writing instruction began to take precedence over speech training. After American independence, the study of English slowly became the study of literature, and rhetoric became less visible in American education. By the turn of the 20th century, students were learning to write mostly by reading literature and writing about literature. But professors in universities like Harvard began to complain about the poor writing of college students. Alexander Bain, the then president of Harvard, developed an entrance exam in English, focusing mostly on errors, which led to the first composition class required by all incoming first-year students. This quickly became the norm in American education. And to this day, most incoming students at the university have to take a writing course. Alexander Bain was also the first scholar to theorize many of the ideas about academic discourse that we're familiar with today. For example, the paragraph. Here is one of the first theorizations of the paragraph. written by Alexander Bain. A paragraph is a collection of sentences with a unity of purpose. A paragraph handles and exhausts a distinct topic. This likely sounds very familiar, and the idea of the paragraph is not actually very old. Many more recent scholars have argued that this type of instruction is too focused on style or fixing errors, which is only a part of the traditional canons of rhetoric that developed during ancient and Roman times, as you can see here. Invention was one of the most important aspects of rhetoric theorized in ancient Greece and ancient Rome, and this was the art of coming up with ideas. And then there's arrangement, or how we structure our ideas. And there's style, the presentation of ideas, and memory, how do we remember the different ideas, and finally delivery, making use of nonverbal cues. Now you'll note that these are clearly associated with different steps in the process of writing. For example, invention is often associated with things like brainstorming. Arrangement is associated with organizing your essay or paper or using an outline. Style is often associated with sentence structure or grammar. And memory is often associated with genres and themes or different ways of getting your audience to remember what you've written. And though delivery is not as often associated with writing, many scholars today are looking at digital writing as a way of rethinking how delivery is associated with writing. In other words, when we write things now, we use a lot of other non-linguistic, non-verbal modes of meaning. For example, video, sound, or other visual elements. But several scholars in the 20th century identify invention as a much neglected aspect of writing instruction. By the mid-20th century, professors began to wonder why focusing on style wasn't improving student essays, drawing on rhetorical theory to teach more aspects of writing to their students. Many claim that invention was the most significant aspect of writing. We don't just use writing to communicate, we use writing to think, problem solve, and come up with new ideas. We rarely know exactly what we want to write before we sit down to write. This movement in the U.S. is often called the New Rhetoric and was comprised of many different kinds of scholars. I'm going to highlight just 3 of the more important figures. I should note at this point that this brief history is mostly comprised of white male thinkers. But in fact, there are many great women and people of color who have influenced rhetoric in other ways. But for the sake of brevity and illustration, I've restricted myself to these major figures, because this is the story that is often told in our field to give the study of writing disciplinary status. I hope that we will have opportunities in the future to discuss other histories of rhetoric, including those that exist within Pakistan and Islam. We'll start now with Edward Corbett, who was one of the first to apply rhetorical principles to writing in his textbook, Classical Greek for the Modern Students. For example, he takes Aristotle's rhetorical triangle and has his students use this heuristic to analyze the writing situation and develop a better sense of audience and purpose. This heuristic can also be used to analyze other texts that students encounter. In fact, many first-year writing classes in the U.S. now have an assignment that we call a rhetorical analysis, where students analyze anything from political speeches to pop songs. New rhetoric significantly expanded the scope of rhetorical studies. If rhetoric is useful in analyzing how we make meaning in speech and text, then it can be useful in analyzing any sort of meaning. In other words, everything's an argument, which is the title of a very popular textbook in the U.S. Just to give you a few examples, I often have students analyze music videos in my first year writing courses. This image is from a video by a band called Gogol Bordello, a band comprised of immigrants from all over the world. They use many different techniques to persuade American audiences to see immigration in a more human light. For example, in this video we see many images of immigrants working hard Or in this image, we see them in the context of their families, humanizing their presence in the U.S. In my business writing class, we often use rhetoric to analyze social media posts. For example, here. Rhetoric is useful when analyzing new contexts for writing and developing strategies that allow students to adapt to these new contexts. We can even analyze objects or things. I noticed while walking around the IIUI campus all the beautiful architecture influenced by Islam. I think it would be easy to argue that this architecture makes a certain argument about the culture and the knowledge base of your university. Universities in the U.S. do very similar things. For example, this structure stands out the two humanity buildings at UNCW, perhaps arguing for our connection with ancient Greek culture, lending us a certain kind of authority. Secondly, I'll briefly mention Kenneth Burke, a major literary theorist who developed many rhetorical theories. For example, he expanded Aristotle's triangle into a pentad to find different ways of examining the same rhetorical situation. For example, we can look at a text and how it is related to any number of combinations of these three terms. Focusing on agency and scene will create a much different analysis or argument than focusing on acts and purposes. Thirdly, Stephen Tolman expanded our ways of analyzing logos, which is one part of Aristotle's rhetorical triangle, with what he called informal logic. Students often have trouble analyzing or breaking down or building an argument. So Tolman created this model to help students identify the warrants or assumptions behind their argument. The same evidence can be used in different ways. For example, I might notice that Chinese students tend to write inductively, where they put their thesis at the end of their essay. If my warrant or assumption is that culture affects writing, then I might say that Chinese cultural patterns cause Chinese writers to write inductively in English. In which case, I would have to back up my assumption with evidence that culture influences writing. On the other hand, my assumption might be that technology influences writing, in which case I would create a very different argument and have to back that warrant in a different way. In the end, new rhetoric scholars believe that students write better if given a purpose and audience. Wayne Booth, another early scholar in rhetoric and composition, tells a story about a grad student who consistently wrote terrible papers. One time he came to his office to complain about a certain interpretation of a text that they were reading. Wayne Booth tells him, well, why don't you just go write about it? And so the student wrote his perspective and handed it into Wayne Booth, and he was amazed by how well written and how interesting that essay was. And he says in this essay, here is a man who had taught freshman composition for several years and who was incapable of committing any of the more obvious errors that we think of as characteristic bad writing. Yet he could not write a decent sentence, paragraph, or paper until his rhetorical problem was solved. Until, that is, he had found a definition of his audience, his argument, and his own proper tone of voice. In other words, fixing style or grammar doesn't make good writing. Students need more. This shift to rhetorical approaches to writing changed writing instruction in several ways. Writing became a worthy research topic, so now we have scholars that actually research the act of writing. Writing is a process, not just product. In other words, awareness of how to write is just as important as the end result, and so many writing classes in the U.S. focus a lot on process. Writing instruction became focused around the audience. Students produce better writing when they have a better notion of who their audience is. Writing also became a critical thinking tool, a way to analyze subject material and think through different ideas. And writing is ultimately also multimodal. In other words, we use more than just words. We use visual elements and sound and video and all the available means at our disposal. Rhetoric then has become a wide field of analysis with many different definitions, not just Aristotle's. Here are just a few examples. In the first quote, rhetoric is rooted in an essential function of language itself, a function that is wholly realistic and continually born anew. The use of language as a symbolic means of inducing cooperation in beings that by nature respond to symbols. In other words, we use language and symbols and meaning to create bonds between different peoples from different points of view and to cooperate and to get things done in the world. Or rhetoric is the art of discovering warrantable beliefs and improving those beliefs in shared discourse. The art of probing what we believe we ought to believe, rather than proving what is true according to abstract methods. In other words, it's a collaborative way of discovering and creating new knowledge. Rhetoric is not just about communicating knowledge, but actually creating knowledge together. And rhetoric is a mode of altering reality, not by direct application of energy to objects, but by the creation of discourse which changes reality through the mediation of thought and action. In other words, rhetoric is everywhere, and as we use rhetoric and manipulate language and culture and different artifacts, we actually change the reality around us. And here's a quote from Derrida, who says, "We should not neglect rhetoric's importance as if it were simply a formal superstructure or technique exterior to the essential activity. Rhetoric is something decisive in society. There are no politics, there is no society without rhetoric, without the force of rhetoric. So to participate in politics, to be a part of society, to make those changes, students have to understand rhetoric and to be able to deploy it in different ways." Ultimately, rhetoric is the art, practice, and study of all human communication, according to Andrea Lunsford. Up to this point in my narrative, I have essentially told you a story. A story often told in the field of rhetoric and composition to provide legitimacy and disciplinary ethos to writing research instruction. Teaching students to write is not just extra work. It's not just something we do to fix students and send them on to their real field of study. Rhetoric and writing is a field of study. It's the study of making meaning in culture, a study of how writing and thinking is intertwined, and ultimately a study of how knowledge is made. As I said before, this is only one story. But I do hope that it helps you get to know me better, and perhaps there is something helpful in this for you to ponder. That said, the story I've told is not the only story. It is one of many, and many in our field are looking for new stories to tell. As a comparative rhetorician, I'm not just interested in sharing what I know about writing instruction or rhetoric. I'm here to learn from you. I would like to take this moment to officially invite you to explore rhetoric and academic writing with me and other faculty at UNCW. Of course, we want to explore what kinds of theories, practices, and research from the U.S. can be adapted to Pakistani and IIUI context. But also, I'm very interested in how might Pakistani and other IIUI cultures contribute to our understandings of rhetoric and academic writing in the U.S. With that, I would like to thank you for giving me this opportunity to learn, and I hope that this trip and this video lecture is the beginning of many great conversations.